and welcome to the BetterU Podcast, where we go in depth and get to listen to stories of hope, strength, and courage straight from some of the leading health, fitness, and wellness experts who help transform lives one person at a time. I'm your host, RKaye, and today we are joined by the lovely Suzanne Jabour, and she is an educator, a grief educator. And today she will be sharing with us how it all began for her. Thank you for joining us today, Suzanne.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so as I was talking to you a while ago, the program in itself is mainly a lot to do about fitness and health and all of that. But of course, in life, we all get to experience grief at a certain point in time. And I have been able to kind of already be a little stalker and look at all your social media shares. And I love just how you are able to help other people. But of course, I'm also interested about how, well, I do have a little bit of input on how it all began for you, but could you tell it straight from you, straight from the heart.
Absolutely.
How everything began for you and how it has truly helped others as well. So could you tell that?
Absolutely. So for me, my most recent grief comes from the death of my son, who died in September of 2020. He was 22, and that out of order loss is absolutely as horrifying, disruptive, immobilizing, life-shattering. You know, most parents don't allow themselves to imagine what that might be like. But those that can imagine, it is, I'm here to tell you it's exactly as horrifying as you think. And one of the things that I started to do just for my own survival was to write, because I couldn't manage all of the swirl that was happening in my head. It was just overwhelming. And early grief, especially with that kind of a loss, is an overwhelming experience. It's a tsunami. And I just felt like I was always under the water. I didn't know which way was up. I was being tossed and turned. And part of what helped me with that was just writing what was happening for me, writing what I was feeling, writing, moments that I missed Ben, writing all kinds of things. And I shared them, as you do, on Facebook, just to friends and family. So it was almost like a public journaling kind of. And part of why I shared it was because I saw really quickly that I didn't know enough about grief in order to grieve well. And most of the people who I had expected would support me and often didn't. Grievers talk often about how grief changes your address book. And I thought, well, why is that? And it's because it's this still taboo topic that we don't talk about. And therefore, we're not learning from each other, right? In every other aspect of our lives, we learn from each other. When it comes to health and fitness, oh my gosh, we're learning from each other, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? But all the time. It's all over on our social media. We're talking to friends about it. Are you doing dry January? Are you doing meatless Monday? Are you at the gym? How many times? Are you swimming or lifting? Are you walking? We're talking about that kind of thing all the time. And that's how we learn from each other as human beings. But we don't talk about grief. And what I discovered was that by sharing what was happening for me, people were able to learn a little bit. And the response I got from people was so overwhelmingly positive that I kept doing it. And I really, it was intentional for me. It really was a matter of survival in those early days. I just had to get the spin out of my head. I had to be able to express what was happening for me. For me, the only option was to grieve out loud. And for a lot of people, they don't feel like that's an option. For me, that was about survival. I knew I had a very clear image in my head. There's a Bugs Bunny cartoon, and I'm dating myself, but there's a Bugs Bunny cartoon where the opera singer sings that note and the glass shatters. And I knew for me, if I couldn't share everything that was happening, if I couldn't own everything that was happening, allow it, face it, there was no space for me to stuff it, which is what we really want to do, right? And how we're kind of raised to deal with grief. We don't want to acknowledge it. We don't want to talk about it. I knew if I tried to stuff it, I was that glass and I would just shatter into a million pieces. So that really that early sharing that was a matter of survival started me down this path of really learning for myself, following experts, finding resources, eventually doing a grief educator certification program, partly to get that educational foundation and partly to really understand how much my experience was, quote unquote, normal, even though there isn't really a normal way to grieve. There are some common symptoms and some common things that happen. And that's one of the main things that I talk about when I'm helping people, because if we understand that the things that are happening to us are normal, then a whole bunch of the fear goes away. Like for me, I didn't understand that the brain fog I was experiencing, that really meant, honestly, like I would stand in the shower and have to think, okay, where am I? Like, what do I do here? Oh yeah, I'm in the shower. Like it was that level of your muscle memory is gone. The things that were easy are impossible. And I didn't understand that that's perfectly normal. And had I known at the time that that was normal, I would have probably felt less worried about it. Like I really felt like, oh my gosh, like Ben has died. The person I was no longer exists, because I was really clear on that immediately. And somehow I have some version of instant onset brain something. Like I really thought there was something wrong and I didn't know how to fix it. And the reality is there's nothing about us that needs fixing. I'm sure you have that conversation when you're talking about fitness. We don't need to be fixed. We need information. We need to build skills. We need to practice, and we need to do. And grief is exactly the same.
I do love a lot of the key points that you discussed. And personally, I mean, in my personal experience, like not everyone does give a particular time. Like there isn't really a fixed amount of time for people to grieve, and that's also one of the things that we need to learn about. So aside from that, are there other particular misconceptions about grief that you'd like to get to share with our audience today, just to help alleviate the thinking that people have with grief? Like you did share that a while ago. Not a lot of people really do want to deal with it. And I myself, I'm not really sure why. Like, why is it that people just tend to think it's such a taboo thing to discuss when we all do get to experience it at one time in our life? So why don't we want to talk about it, right? So could you explain that to us? Maybe there's something that we all really need to learn about in terms of that.
Yeah, I think the thing that keeps us from talking about it, there's two sources that I kind of see. One of them is fear. We have a lot of fear about grief, and fear comes from lack of understanding and knowledge, right? What we don't know, what we don't understand is scary. And that makes perfect sense. So it becomes this kind of, bad snowball where we feel fear. So then we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to do it wrong, right? We don't want to hurt the person. We don't want to do harm. So then we end up kind of saying nothing. And the person who's grieving doesn't really understand what's happening to them. And they don't want to look like there's something wrong with them, right? I pretty openly shared about a lot of things when I was really uncomfortable about them. But for most people, if you feel like there's something wrong with you, we don't want to share that. For the most part, we don't live in a culture where we share our weaknesses, right? So there's all kinds of cultural pressure to be strong, to be independent, to be capable, to be good, all that stuff that is kind of part of the culture and the way we're supposed to present ourselves. And if you're being honest about how your grief is going, especially in those really early days with a big loss like the death of a loved one, you're none of those things. There was no face that I could put on that was going to fit with how we're kind of expected to present ourselves. And I think a lot of that is breaking down. The more we talk about mental health and addiction and things like that, and the more we break down, and we really look at how broken and dysfunctional our society is and how that's impacting all of us, I think there's a lot more space to talk about what's really real for us. But we still have a lot of fear around grief. And I don't know if we feel like somehow it's catching and like it might happen to us, or I'm not sure, but there's a lot of fear there, I think mostly from lack of knowledge. And then the other piece is around our collective kind of societal norm where we don't really share our emotional selves. We share them when we're happy or joyful or glad or celebrating, but we don't really share when we're in the depths of despair, right? This is not what we're Instagramming about, unless we're being honest. And so if we can break down some of that careful curation that we do of what we present to the world, and even it, I'm old enough that I watched kind of the evolution of social media from when it didn't even exist. And like you would watch Entertainment This Week to find out what was happening with celebrities, right? I'm very old, right? But now then we sort of looked and went, well, those celebrities, they're all just curating their lives. Like they're not being honest. They're not telling us what's real. But now we're all doing that. So we're getting further and further away from genuine connection where we really share where we're brilliant and where we're struggling. And so I think the fear and then this kind of sense that we want to present well kind of comes together to create a situation where when your life feels like a post-apocalyptic nightmare and you don't know how to have a shower, there's not a lot of space for you.
Well, that just made me sad. I mean,
it's really kind of sad. I know. But we can change it. That's the good news, right?
Exactly. And I love that you did get to point that out to everyone who's listening to us today, because why is it, guys, that it's just the happy and joyful moments that we get to share with people, when the fact is our social media, it's pretty much people we should be comfortable with. It's usually our friends and our family. So why don't we get to share things like grief with them, right? I love that you shared in your pre-interview that you want grief to be something that's normal, something that people can really be able to talk about. I also love that you do get to work with businesses. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? I'm curious, how does it go for you? Like, you particularly work with companies to deal with their employees, or how does it go for you in helping those people?
Yeah, so I've developed a program that I work either with leaders who want to really boost their ability to support people who are grieving, or with businesses that really want to look at it at a structural level, because there really is some practical support that we can provide people so they can be more successful at work. And especially right now, when we have like a global staffing shortage of all sorts, the more that companies are taking exceptional care of their people, the more successful that they are. Right? We know workplace culture. MIT did an article about, 8 months or so ago, talking about workplace culture versus compensation. And workplace culture was a 10 times better indicator of retention than compensation. So how we're treated, whether we can bring our whole selves to work, right? Being able to have emotions at work, for example, right? I'm going to date myself again, but the days where you sort of had to, we would have meetings where they would say, like, leave your troubles at the door. Like, don't bring that here. Like, we're just coming here to be worker bees. And like, that's shifted so much. And this is just another level that we can shift it. And really what we're looking at in that program is, grief skill building. So really talking about what are some of the normal symptoms, like grief education 101, right? What are some of the normal symptoms? How might they show up at work? What can we put in place to support people who are experiencing those symptoms? And how can we open up conversations about grief and loss in the workplace so that it's a more normal part of what we talk about, right? Every business has some grief embedded in it somewhere. So we can understand that really easily when we think about something like healthcare, right? Where you have patients and maybe the patient is unfortunately doesn't recover from their illness. So we can wrap our heads around it there. That makes sense to us. But when we broaden the definition of grief to be a normal response to losses of all kinds, then we can see that really we have grief quite a lot of the time. Not extreme grief like I experienced because my child died. Of course, it's not that level. But we do have some of those things happen to us with the loss of an opportunity, the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a home, the loss of a business. All kinds of losses are around us. And especially now, the new normal that we were all so excited to rush towards appears to mostly be about disruption and nothing being what we expect it to be, and historic levels of systemic breakdown and environmental catastrophe and war and unrest, right? Like, we're watching loss around us all the time. So if we can talk about those losses, we can practice, right? This is a place we can practice. The same way you wouldn't have a new client come to you and say, oh, here, deadlift this, I don't even know what's a lot of weight, 500 pounds. That's really a lot. That's an outrageous amount. You wouldn't say that. You would say, okay, well, let's assess where you're at. Let's start to build our skills with this goal that one day we'll be able to do that big thing. So the goal is that one day we could talk about grief the same way we talk about all kinds of other things that are going on for us. But we have to start where we are. And where we are is uncomfortable, fearful, with not great skills for most of us. So we can learn the skills, we can learn the symptoms, we can start to understand how the timeline really works. It's way longer than we think, and that's okay. And some people are shorter, some people are longer, but the expectation should be that it's longer than we think. It's, if you think it's days, it's months. If you understand that it's months, I'll tell you it's years. For me, I will grieve the loss of my child forever, and that should be the expectation. I should grieve him forever. He's not going to be here, and I desperately wish he was. So it's that sense of normalizing, where does that grief show up in your workplace? So we know your team is going to bring it from their personal lives, whether it's collective or it's something that's happening distinctly in their life. We know it happens in the workplace. And then if you have customers, clients, patients, students, whoever it is, shoppers, they often are coming with grief. So how do you support them? What are simple things that you can do to make your business more friendly? Like, grocery stores are really complicated for grievers, and we could make it easier. We could fix the music, right? I was on a hilarious chat the other day with a bunch of grievers talking about the grocery store because it's a really hard place for a lot of reasons. And one of them is the music. Right? And so everyone was putting in the names of the songs that they had heard recently at the grocery store. And it's things like, how can I live without you? What will I do when you're gone? Like, all of these kinds of things. And I'm like, nobody needs to hear that while they're picking out their carrots. Like, we just don't. But that's what's on the music, and that's activating. And then all of a sudden you're trying to push your cart and get your 4 things, and you're sobbing in the aisle, and you abandon your cart and you go home because it's just so hard. Because then you also can't talk about it. People look at you like there's something wrong with you. It's so complicated, but there's really simple things we can do to help. And as we start down that path and we start to see more, right? I'm just looking all the time going, how can we fix that? How can we fix that? How can we fix that? How can we make that easier? How can we make it better? And the thing that's really fascinating to me is so many of the things that would make it better for a griever actually make it better for a whole lot of other people. So I wrote a post the other day, for example. This is a great example and a takeaway for your listeners. One of the things we often ask people we're getting to know is, how many children do you have? If we stop to think about it, that's actually a really personal question.
It is. Yeah.
That we're asking very early in our relationship as a getting to know you kind of question. For someone like me, I have to make a split-second decision about whether I tell the truth that I know is going to suck the air out of the room and end the conversation, or I tell some kind of softened version, or I just tell something else. So I'm having to make that decision in a split second. Now, my choice, because of who I am and how I approach this issue, is I tell you the whole truth. And I know I have the skills to keep the conversation going and have it so that it's not like a bomb went off, right? But not every griever does. And in the early days, especially, really hard to navigate. So let's shift that question for grievers. But then it also helps people who desperately wanted children and couldn't have them, or people who don't want children and feel judged because they don't want children. So it takes all of that muck out of the conversation, because instead of how many children do you have, we could say something like, tell me about your family. And then the person you're asking gets to decide, what are they going to tell? You could tell all about your found family. Maybe your biological family or your family that raised you is completely dysfunctional and nuts and you don't want to talk about them. You could talk about your found family. You could talk about anything. It's a nice, open, gentle question that doesn't have a minefield for so many people. So we approach it as if we're looking at grief, because that's the lens we're going to look at. And then we look at how else does that help? How do we broaden that to look at how does that help everyone who's struggling? How does that help people who are thriving be even better, right? So we're looking at this all holistically through the lens of grief, because we know grievers are at work and we know they're suffering because there's not a lot of support.
That is just, the term you use is fascinating. I am very fascinated right now.
Oh, good.
I did relate to your grocery situation back there, because I was like, yeah, I did get to experience that once in my life, where there was like music playing. I don't know where I was, and it was like music that reminded me of someone. And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna leave now because this is not good for me.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Suzanne, I would have liked to keep our conversation going, but of course, the show has to have an end for us, at least for now. I would love to have you again for another episode in the future. But before we get to wrap things up, is there maybe one or two pieces of advice that you could leave our audience today, especially if someone is actually listening to us and currently experiencing grief themselves? Is there one thing that you'd like to share with them today that would probably help them a lot in their...
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you have come across this podcast and you're experiencing grief yourself, I want to encourage you to give yourself permission, because you're not going to get it from our culture right now. So you have to give that permission to yourself to grieve fully and well, whatever that means for you, without worrying about what society is telling you you're supposed to do, because most of that is coming from ignorance. So well-meaning, but a little bit ignorant. So you have to give yourself that permission. And really, the only way to navigate grief in a healthy way is to navigate grief, is to face it, to allow it. And even when that feels impossible, to just take one more breath, one more little step, one next right choice, and baby step by baby step, continue on.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us today, Suzanne. And thank you for, again, taking the time to be with us today on the BetterU Podcast. Now, guys, if you are currently experiencing grief and you'd like the assistance and the help from someone who really, really will be able to, manage to go through the hoops and all the changing of your current experience in life, I will be leaving all of Susan's information in the description box below, so you can go and check out her wonderful work. Thank you again, Susan, for joining us today. And to everyone listening to our show, thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. I'll see you guys again next week, but not before reminding you to never give up on your movement journey, because it's never too late to move. Bye, guys. See you again.